started, a little bit about me. So I currently look after product development for wellbeing and employee experience at a company called Benefex. I've been working in the kind of employee engagement, employee experience space for the last 2 decades-ish, maybe 1 year short of that. Done lots of writing, doing lots of stuff at the moment with Engaged Success, a non-profit in the UK, helping organisations do more for the wellbeing engagement for their staff, and lots of kind of things, lists, etc. I'm also the author of the book, as April mentioned. This was an interesting exercise for me. This was basically the 20 years of my life that started to look at. There were so many organisations in the world that were doing really good things, and we heard all the case studies and all the books and research looked at Google and Microsoft and Apple to tell us this is how we should run our organisations. But actually what we started to realise is that about 90% of people in this country work for an SME. They don't work for those companies, those big experimental companies that have huge budgets. They work for organisations that just can't do the same kind of things. And so I wanted to start writing about how can we actually improve the employee experience for the vast majority of people with small things you could do tomorrow without huge amounts of resource or any investment at all. The book got on the Amazon bestseller list in the week that it was published, which was quite surprising because it's a self-published book. It wins an award on Thursday, and people have had some really nice things to say about it. But if you look at some of the most recent Amazon reviews, somebody said it's a collection of incoherent references. So make up your own mind. There's no pleasing some people, and lots of organisations have supported the book and the publication of the book. If any of you want to tweet along and tweet me, I'm at World of Good Book, and share some pictures. I'll select some of you and we'll give some copies of the books away to you. But what I wanted to talk about today, this is kind of a bit different to a lot of the talks I do, and I decided I wanted to kind of just pose 5 questions to you all. And it's a way of just getting you to think a little bit about the future of work, how the organisations that you work for are changing. I don't have all the answers. The book isn't prescriptive. I'm not the kind of person that would come into my clients and say, this is how you need to do stuff. I think you can talk to people and you can get people to come up with their own ideas if you start to get them to think differently and show them a different way of it being done. So that's kind of what I want to go through today. So the first question is, what if we start admitting there are problems? For the 20 years I've been doing this, most people are pretty afraid to admit that there's problems in their organisation. I spoke to somebody recently who wanted to run out an employee survey and they wanted to focus on well-being, and we suggested asking some questions around financial well-being. And the response was, well, we can't really solve that for people, so we don't want to ask that question. And it led me to kind of have a conversation that said, you know, that stuff doesn't stop existing because you haven't asked a question about it. If people are suffering with the amount of debt that they have, if the financial well-being or the financial literacy is really poor, that doesn't stop existing because you fail to ask them a question or you don't think it's your responsibility to help. And I think it's really important for us to realise that everyone at work has an experience. The difference is whether we've designed it that way or not. And what we're starting to see now is plenty of organisations looking at the kind of what they call pre-hire to retire. So the idea that the employee experience starts before somebody even applies for a job with you. So that employee experience starts the moment they come to a building like Havas for an event like this and they think this would be a cool place to work. That's when that employee experience starts. And one of the things that's coming out of wellbeing at the moment, so any of you that looked at any research into wellbeing, there's 2 really big studies that came out of the US in the last 2 months. The University of Chicago did a really big study, and a company called BJ's Wholesale, which they probably should have changed the name. Somebody should have told them a long time ago. But they studied all 33,000 employees that work for their organisation, and they randomly assigned them to a wellbeing program. They then measured those employees for a year and a half, so quite an extensive period over a really large sample size. And they found that the workplace wellbeing initiative they'd rolled out had absolutely no effect on the employees whatsoever. And numerous studies have come out in the last couple of months to show exactly the same thing, that it makes no difference to wellbeing spend, it makes very little difference to health cost spend, especially in the US, and it doesn't even affect things like gym visits and how much people smoke. Actually, with most of these pieces of research, if you smoke, you are less likely to be involved in the wellbeing program. If you go to the gym regularly, you're more likely to be in the program. So actually, all it does is just enhance the people who are already kind of conscious around their wellbeing. But what we fail to realise is the fact that there are things that we do as employers that affect the well-being of our staff. So it makes no difference how much money we're spending on gym visits and apples in the office and the latest app for people to start moving around. Actually, lots of the policies that we have in place as employers affect the well-being of the staff that we work with. And there's some really big pieces of research that come out to prove that. And a great example, I was speaking with an organisation recently. There's a guy I know who runs his own business. It's a digital agency, it's 50 people and it's growing pretty rapidly. And he was quite concerned about losing the culture that they've created, and they do have a really good positive culture as the kind of growing pains of acquisitions and as that company grew. And his response to me was kind of, I need to make sure this culture doesn't change. How can you help me with that? And I was like, well, just ask people. And he came back to me a couple of days later and said, I've sent out a survey and I've asked everybody. I was like, you're 50 people. Why did you just go and ask them? Why are you sending them a survey? Ask them what they want. Ask them what's troubling them and just repair it that way. And he actually ended up running some focus groups with some of the people in his organisation. And he found that despite the fact that on warm days they buy everyone ice lollies and ice creams, and on cold days everyone gets a free Starbucks, and they send people home early on Fridays sometimes, they pay for mindfulness, they pay for masseurs to come into the office and give people massages all the time. They're a really, really good culture. They did a great thing on Pancake Day where they gave everyone the tools to make pancakes in the office, but all the remote workers got sent a gift box to their home with all the tools to make a pancake at home. So really, really thoughtful company. And when they sat down with all the employees and they asked them what they wanted at the organisation, they said, more holiday. You give us 21 days, the absolute minimum, and you make us take 3 days off between Christmas and New Year. So actually, you're giving us 18 days. And that mismatches all the partners and our boyfriends and girlfriends, so we end up with not being able to go on the same holidays because we don't get enough. And the second thing was, you don't pay us for sick pay. So people were coming in sick all the time. This is an organisation that's predominantly kind of 20 to 25-year-olds, and they were literally getting sick of people coming in sick all the time. And they were the two things that they wanted them to change. So everything else they did was making no difference to those immediate desires that those employees wanted. Hands up who believes they've got disengaged employees in their organisation, usually referred to as deadwood. And how many of you people employed those people as deadwood? If there's any recruiters in the room, this guy needs some help with their recruitment exercises. When we have disengaged employees, we've done something to them to make them disengaged. They weren't like that. And I think part of the problem that we face is people really struggle to admit that there's a problem in their organisation, and that's a starting point for anything. So I think that's the first question we need to ask ourselves is we need to admit that there are problems. One of the other things as well that I really pointed out, I was watching, did anyone watch Comedians in Cars Drinking Coffee on Netflix? Great program if you've never watched it. But they spoke to Christoph Waltz, and they were having lots of conversations with him about his career. And he said this quote, and I think it belongs to somebody else, but I couldn't find out online who originally it came from. But he talks about actually there's no such thing as bad actors, there's just actors in the wrong roles. And I think we could take that into the workplace. I think when we talked about disengaged employees, sometimes we just have to admit that these aren't evil, disengaged, toxic employees. I don't like the word toxic employees. I think they are employees that just do not work in the environment that we've created anymore. And that might have been because of time, and it might be fine to allow those people to move on. But we're in a world now where it's really expensive to hire people, it's really expensive to train them. We need to put more effort into making sure that if there's an issue with somebody that we try and solve that. Second question, what if we trusted employees from day one? So trust is fundamental to any relationship that we have in our lives. It's a whole chapter of my book is dedicated to Denmark and how they deal with trust in the whole of society. So not just as employees, but in the whole society in general. It's a fundamental part of any relationship that we have, yet it doesn't exist the way that we need it to in the workplace. And I think in trust is something you give, and then you implicitly give trust, I think. I think if you're the kind of person that's suspicious about people, mistrusting of people, you'll probably lead a pretty unhappy life. I think it's really good for us to start trusting people and then just allow them to abuse that trust than to just walk around not trusting people at all. And I think in the employment context, that trust is not given out by the employer first. We sit back and expect somebody to earn our trust. And one of the things we do that is probation periods. I hate probation periods. I think probation periods are a load of bollocks, and I really don't like them at all. But when you think about what probation period is saying, I've looked at you, I've met you, I've probably interviewed you 3 times, I've looked you up on LinkedIn, I've stalked you online, I've made a decision that you're the best person to come and work for me, but I'm not quite sure on that decision, so I'm going to give it 3 months or, God forbid, 6 months. And then you have that period of anxiety and mistrust where you know your employer hasn't really fully committed to you. You might have completely committed to the organisation, but they haven't really committed to you in the way that you want to. And I think you think about any other relationship, so again, thinking about how trust in all the relationships we have. Imagine if you were going out with somebody and you kind of got to that magical third date. I think 3 is the right number, isn't it? And you get to the third date and you kind of want to take it to the next level, but you kind of say, okay, I'm going to let you know, we're just going to take this a little bit slow. We're going to have 3 months and we're going to sit around again and we're going to have a review of this relationship. And I'm going to decide whether we move to the next level and we move in together or whatever it might be. It just doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't breed trust. It does the opposite. And actually, when you look at things like unlimited leave, which has its issues and is still in its infancy, but that actually breeds the complete opposite. That's us saying, we completely trust you to make the right decisions for you and the business. And I think that's why we're starting to see that become really popular. Because if you look at lots of the research, most people don't take more than about 40 days holiday when they have unlimited leave. And actually, most people who don't take the most amount of time are the high performers. So the high performers, as we learned before, are a little bit more self-conscious and handle stress a little bit worse than the others. So actually what we start to see is people don't really take the piss. They actually know what the parameters are. They know if they've done enough work to justify extra holiday. And we're only as good as the worst behaviour we tolerate. So when we talk about trust in a culture, I've seen it completely eroded by the fact that we've allowed people to be toxic and to be an outlier and to avoid the rules. And you see this quite a lot with sales teams in particular. So you have a high-performing individual in a sales team who's bringing money in, and they start to not act against everything, your values, your cornerstones. They don't want to be part of your culture. And you can identify these in probably almost every organisation if you've got a sales team. There's a lot of nods, a lot of people have seen these people. And obviously they've got revenue tied to them, so nobody wants to kind of tackle those people. And typically what we tend to do is just take that person and kind of put them off to the side. So you move them a little bit out of a team, or they work from home or remotely a little bit more, and nobody really questions them because we can't afford to lose them. And I understand why businesses do that, but the effect I've seen that have on a culture is really, really poor, because it makes everyone else realise that, well, actually, what are we trying to be? Because it doesn't matter what stuff you put on your website, it doesn't matter how good you say your company is, or what quote you've got plastered up on the side of your office wall. It doesn't matter if you're not treating people in the same way that they expect to be treated as a group. Put relationships first, I guess, is the summary of that. I think when you build positive relationships with your employees, everything else comes forward. I think when you trust them, I think when you give them the space to kind of breathe and make decisions themselves, that relationship is really, really important to everything that comes next. Question 3, what if we didn't design for bad apples? So I think, when we look at HR policy in general, so has anyone watched Mad Men in the room? So you think about Mad Men, think about the environment in the workplace that Mad Men is. So there is almost nothing about Mad Men that you would allow in today's working society. You wouldn't allow the misogyny, you wouldn't allow the drinking, the smoking, just everything about it is it completely goes opposite to what we want to build in the workplace nowadays. Yet that's when we built most of our management processes, and we haven't changed them since. So actually what we start doing, you see this a lot now, people just take technology and put that on top of really old management processes. And our CEO says, if you take a shit process and digitize it, it's still a shit process. And we see that a huge amount. So actually, when you look at how the world has developed and how society has developed, even in the last 5 years, you start, we work at here, we've got Marsha P. Johnson, the trans activist that started the Stonewall riots, has got a whole lift dedicated to her in this building. Yet 5 years ago, people weren't as accepting as trans people as they are now. And so society's changed at a huge, huge pace, and the workplace isn't keeping up with that. And what we tend to find is, a good question to ask yourself is, if you're changing policy, whether it's HR or business policy that to do with your people, if you can think of who you're writing that policy for, you shouldn't be writing that policy. And typically what we see this in flexible working. I get asked all the time about flexible working. Yeah, sounds great, wouldn't work in our organisation. Why not? Well, we've got this guy, Mark, in my team, and he's just going to take the piss, and it's not going to really work. And so it's kind of like, so why is he working there? You don't trust him to go home, but you're going to create a policy that will screw over the other 90% of people because the 10% of people that you don't trust. Question 4, what if we stop trying to define and measure everything? Now this is going to conflict with some of the talks later on today. But I think we've become obsessed in HR with measuring things. We want to know what your starting point is and how have we shown an improvement. And lots of that is driven by the fact that we make commercial decisions. We want to prove return on investment. But actually there's some softer measures that are coming out now, things like value on investment, if anyone's ever heard of that. We're starting to look at actually how are we measuring the emotions of our workforce, how are we improving their lives, how are we making lives better for them. And it's stuff that becomes really, really hard to measure. And the one thing that kind of struck me when I was pulling this slide deck together is on the next slide. And if you've got the logical song in your head, you're about to have a different song in your head. The song "What Is Love" by Hadaway kind of when I was putting this slide deck together, this really stuck in my head because we talk about engagement. How can you measure engagement? How can you measure employee experience? How can you measure well-being at work? And those things are so fluid and so personalised to the individual. What is important to my well-being now is going to be what's important to my well-being now is sleep, because I spent 2 hours at a pensions conference before I came here. What's important to my well-being now is sleep. What's important to my well-being tomorrow is going to be very different. And it's the same with engagement. Our priorities change quite quickly. Our life cycles change quite quickly. Tomorrow we could become fathers and mothers, and that could completely change our priorities. And so what makes us happy and what makes us feel well completely changes. And so when you think about engagement, I kind of thought about love, and I think, how many people in the room are in love? Seems like a nice question to ask a group of people. That's quite a lot for London. Well, what was it we were saying earlier on? That it's easy to have a one-night stand in London, but it's more difficult to fall in love. We were talking about other people saying that, not us. But I think love is one of the things that, we know what it is. We all want it. It's great when we've got it, but it's quite hard for us to measure. And how do we measure that in other people? So how can you go to somebody else and say, you are in love and that is a good thing? It's very difficult for us to measure. So I think some of this stuff doesn't mean we shouldn't measure it. I think we should be mindful that we don't always have to measure things. We did some great research with King's College London on financial well-being recently. And when we asked HR why they want to do more for to improve the financial well-being of their staff, the overarching answer from everyone we spoke to was because it was the right thing to do. And we hear that an awful lot. And the difficulty is, it's when you need to ask for money to implement a piece of technology or HR tech or whatever it is, you kind of need to prove that return on investment. But I think as an organisations, we're getting better at understanding that not everything works on a kind of profit and loss basis in the same way that we expected it to. Question 5, what if we stop treating everyone the same? So this is a bit of a controversial one, I think, but everything in our lives is completely personalised. You think about Netflix. If you want to see how Netflix personalises content to you, open your computer, your phone next to somebody else, and you'll see that they will have films that you're pretty sure aren't on yours. And you'll be able to kind of look through it and say, I didn't realise I had that film. But it's because they start to personalise that content to you. Amazon does it as well. On the consumer side, it's become so important to personalise things to us. Yet in the workplace, we seem to take this blanket approach that if we treat everyone the same, that's the fair thing to do. And if you think about that Mad Men example, most people in work during Mad Men's time in the 50s were men, white men. So actually, when those management processes were made, did we build some processes that are now excluding people who are in the LGBT plus community, who are of different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds? So I think it's kind of, we're in a situation where we shouldn't be treating people the same anymore. I think we should be treating people as the individuals that they are. And that means that for some people, you allow them to work at home because that works right for them. And if somebody wants to work in the office, we let them work in the office. And we see it with flexible working. People are obsessed with the idea that we couldn't have a 4-day week because we need people here on a Friday. And it's like, not everyone's going to take the same 4 days. You'll have people taking days that work for you and some that don't. And we did this at Benefix. We reduced the working week by 2.5 hours. Only a small change, and kind of everyone went, yeah, so what? It worked out to be about 6% pay rise, but everyone was a bit like, so what? And then we started hearing the stories of the people that could actually leave a little bit later so they could say goodbye to their kids in the morning, or they could pick them up from school for the first time in 5 years, or the one guy who loved Pointless and wanted to watch Pointless live and get home for it. He liked tweeting along for it. But we started to see that actually those small changes, because we were able to personalise. And even when it came to myself, I live in Cardiff, I do a lot of work in London, I'm in London every week. Our office is Southampton. My response was 2.5 hours kind of makes no difference to me. I do 40 hours by the time Thursday comes along. And then the response was, we'll take it all together in a half day on a Friday. So for the last 12 months, I'll be doing a 4.5-day week. And I love it, it's brilliant. And so I think that's allowing people to customise their experience at work to themselves and personalise it is really, really important. We touched upon, Magdalene touched upon this slightly. People want to see more conscious workplaces. So when you think about that personalisation, what we're starting to see is Employees from really large organizations are lobbying their employers to say, I want you as an organization to be more like me as an individual. So we saw this with Google. When lots of Google employees found out that some AI technology that Google was creating was going to be used by the Pentagon to more accurately target drone strikes, they put a petition together. And I think about 6,000 Google employees got a petition together and said to the CEO, this is not the kind of company we want to work for. And actually the CEO and the board responded and they canned that project. You've seen the same at Ted Baker, where employees have started lobbying the board of Ted Baker and saying, I don't care if he's the founder, he doesn't demonstrate the values that we want to see as an organization. We saw it with Nike, and they're standing behind Colin Kaepernick in the US. You see Ben & Jerry's do it all the time with their same-sex marriage branded ice creams. They're happy to exclude consumers, but what that's starting to do is encourage people to work for them that have those values and for them to really drive values. The sidebar to that is there was an employee recently who worked for Apple who was right-wing, had very right-wing tendencies, and wrote a blog post online to say actually they felt really uncomfortable working in a left-wing organization. So we actually started to see a flip of what we'd expect to see. And Tim Cook kind of called that out directly and kind of said, our consumers represent everybody in society, so actually we need to start representing everyone in society within our organization. And then that starts to conflict. That brings a whole suite of issues that if Apple's going to go out there and celebrate Pride Day and change their logo to the rainbow flag for Pride Month, how does that affect some of their employees? So there's lots for us to think about, and there's quite a lot to unpack there. But again, that's down to that personalising the experience for the employee. And I think as I've kind of covered, that kind of looks at reflecting the values of society and the people that live and work in it at the time. And so my one final thought is that your destiny as employers is tied up in your employees. The interesting thing about employee engagement is we don't really notice it when the going's good. But when you work in an organisation where people are really struggling, where the organisation's starting to make redundancies, when the organisation is starting to kind of suffer profit loss and that kind of thing, you really see engagement then. That's when you really see it come alive. And there's a great book by Ben Horowitz called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and it shows you the importance of a founder and a CEO who needs those people to be around him and be supportive. But we're all in this together. There's no one in this world. Apple is nothing without the people that design the product and distribute it and sell it to you in the shops. So everything is about the employees, and it's really, really important that we continue to realise that actually without employees, we're nothing. So it's really important for us to look after them. And that's it for me. Thank you.